New York's first kelp hatchery. Dr. Goldberg, can you tell us about your work and your focus on kelp as a climate solution that has quantifiable impacts and benefits for the health of our bays?
I sure will. So thank you for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be speaking with everyone, and it's very exciting to see actually the interest in this topic, and exciting to be speaking with you all. So just to jump right into it, I'm going to try to cover a little bit just background here, since I'm leading things off, and then really focus on environmental benefits from kelp, including combating climate change. So just jumping right into things here. If you didn't know, seaweeds are farmed around the world, but if we come to the United States, the most commonly farmed seaweed is kelp, sugar kelp. This is known as scientifically, genus and species, Latissima saccharina. And, and globally, actually, seaweeds are, there's billions of dollars made in farming seaweeds, primarily in Asia. But it's an emerging market in the United States, both in the Northeast, but also on the West Coast. So New York is a little bit behind the curve, but I'm confident, like with many environmental things in New York, that we can soon get to the head of the curve. Beyond the fact that it's already farmed in the Northeast, importantly, kelp is actually indigenous to our local waters. So this is a picture of kelp taken from Long Island Sound. And I'll soon show you our kelp hatchery, and we run that hatchery using and spawning indigenous kelp from Long Island waters. And Sean may cover this, but the nice thing about kelp and the way we're really considering it is the way that it can be integrated with ongoing aquaculture activities. In New York, the biggest source of aquaculture in New York is oysters, and there's more than 36 oyster farms across New York. And the nice thing about kelp is that it can be integrated into oyster farms vertically. And so that is to say that an oyster farmer wouldn't need more acreage to support farming kelp. It can be put right on the lines that have the current shellfish cages, be they surface or bottom. And the other important thing is that kelp adds, it's the opposite growing season of oysters. And what it does for, I'm going to speak to the environmental benefits, and Sean may touch on this as well, but I think it's worth just stating that it really, people talk about sustainability. This is going to contribute to the sustainability and the resilience of aquaculture. Like I said, there's about 36 oyster farms across New York State. And really, when it comes to marine aquaculture, oysters are the only game in town. And we learned on the eastern end of Long Island in the middle and early 20th century, if you're a farmer, approaching farming with a single crop is I was going to say a fool's endeavor, but it is not the way to farm resiliently, because it leaves you vulnerable to disease of your crop, to turn down in the economy. And frankly, this was acutely apparent during the 2020 COVID crisis. That is, COVID hit, and the biggest market for oysters were restaurants. Well, nobody was going to restaurants at the rate they had in the past during 2020. And frankly, a lot of oyster farmers, because that's what they farmed, found themselves in financial dire straits because they could not sell their product. And so the other nice thing beyond the environmental benefits is that this has the ability to make aquaculture, marine aquaculture, more sustainable in New York State, as providing a second crop that complements the growing season of oysters. So we did start the first New York State DEC permitted kelp hatchery in New York State in 2019. This is at the Stony Brook Southampton Marine Sciences Center. And what we do is we spawn reproductive blades of kelp onto what we call seed strings, which are shown here. And so you can see the strings, what essentially these are PVC pipes with wound with string. We have the kelp spawn within the tanks. We add that spawn to them, and over a short period of time, you see them go from the white to the brown, which means that this spawn has been successful and the kelp is starting to grow. And I should say, as I showed in a slide 2 prior, we had this success because of a great collaboration with the organization Greenwave. They have been pioneers in promoting kelp aquaculture all throughout the Northeast. And frankly, we got our start because the head of that organization, Bren Smith, came out to us and talked to us about kelp, frankly, in 2018. And we struck a collaboration since then. We got a grant together from the United States Department of Agriculture, and that really spawned what we're doing here. So really, that our establishment of this kelp hatchery was with a great assist from Greenwave. And we've done it successfully for 2 seasons now, producing about 50 spools of kelp. We have plenty of room to grow in this. And each spool can be a 100 to 200 foot line of kelp. During the past 3 seasons, we've worked on more than 10 oyster farms all across New York State. They're color coded here. You can see in the red in 2019, we were on East End Oyster on Long Island Sound and 2 sites in the South Shore, in Great South Bay, Lucky 13, and in Moriches Bay, the Great Gun Shellfish Farm, Oyster Farm. And we've been there those 2 we've been out on every single year. So it's harder to see the 2020 sites there, but we've been there 2019, 2020, and 2021. In 2020, we also had additional sites at Widow's Hole Oyster Farm in Greenport, and also out on Fisher's Island at the Fisher's Island Oyster Farm. And this year, in exciting news, we have support from Suffolk County to expand the work we're doing. And we're working on 5 different oyster farms across the Peconic Estuary. All of these farms are involved in the Suffolk County aquaculture lease program. So they're already oyster farmers there. And this year we're growing kelp on their farms. So just to show very quickly, I'm not going to show a lot of data in this talk, but just to give you a sense of some of the yields. This is our results from 2020 across multiple sites. In some cases, also showing multiple seed strings. But importantly, and I've mentioned that kelp is the opposite growing season of the oysters. And here you can see that in action. We put the kelp out, generally the lines in December. And you can see they grow ever so slightly until the water begins to warm up, and then they really take off in spring. And what you'll see is none of these lines go into July. So we're harvesting these kelp in either May or June, depending on the year and the temperatures. But what you can see is we're getting some really amazing yields. In some cases, up to 9 pounds of kelp in just 1 foot of line. And again, we're putting out on each farm, on average, we're usually putting out at least 3 lines that are 100 feet. So that's close to 1,000 pounds. And you can see that is generated literally, the growth takes off in March. So there's almost nothing on the lines in March. But by the time it comes to harvest, just 2 months later, again, up to 1,000 pounds per farm with just 3 lines. These kelp blades are incredibly long. Here's Mike Dole. And I should have mentioned, I failed to mention, Mike Dole is really he's the head of restorative aquaculture in my lab group. And he, frankly, were it not for Mike, I would not be here talking about this today. He was an oyster farmer out in Montauk for 10 years. He's been working with me for the past 4 years. And within the first year, he brought Bren Smith to Southampton to start this conversation about kelp. So I give all the credit to Mike for his hard work. And you can see here, it's not these blades are we're not just getting great weights, but you can see amazing lengths on these blades, more than 10 feet in some cases. And I won't just say that when we began this effort prior to our work just 3 years ago, and frankly, when we started, we had some people say to us, you're not going to have any success. You are targeting shallow estuaries like Moriches Bay, where the mean water depth is only 4 feet. There's no way you're going to get the kelp to grow. And because the kelp's going to drag in the sediment and it's going to get fouled. Well, anyway, the bottom line is through this project, we've been able to prove kelp grows wonderfully in shallow water. And in fact, we're getting better yields in shallow water than we are in deep water. So again, before this, everyone assumed that it had to be done in deeper waters like Long Island Sound and the deeper part of the Peconics. Our best site has been in Moriches Bay, where at low tide, we might just have a foot of water. And the kelp is just dragging through the sediment with the currents, and it loves it. It's growing very well. Okay, so to talk about a little bit about what the benefits are of these of the kelp. These are photosynthetic organisms. So as you all know, they're taking up carbon dioxide, which is obviously a big focus of drawdown and drawing down carbon. I'm also very interested in the fact they take up a lot of nitrogen. They're a sponge for nitrogen. So you're getting both the carbon and the nitrogen. And we know their waste product is oxygen. So they're oxygenating our waters. And I'm going to just show you a little bit about what maybe they can be doing against harmful algal blooms. To go through just a little bit of data. Do they take up carbon? Well, they sure do. And so here you can see we're getting, they contain about 25% of their dry weight is carbon. You can see that here. No difference across sites. They are quite rich in carbon, maybe slightly more in the Long Island Sound site. But they also take up plenty of nitrogen. And here we're showing the amount of nitrogen milligrams per milligram dry weight. In this case, it's a little bit closer to 3%. But here we're seeing differences. And this was interesting to me. We're getting more nitrogen, richer nitrogen content in the shallower sites. And these are sites that, we have to hone in on where these sites are precisely. But the sites where Moriches Bay the sites in Great Isles Bay and Moriches Bay are shallow sites closer to land. The Long Island Sound place, Long Island Sound is the third largest estuary in the United States, so we don't want to make generalizations, but this is really an almost essential and eastern part of Long Island Sound where the nitrogen levels are actually quite low. So the interesting trend here is that the regions with the highest nitrogen concentrations, the kelp are taking up actually more nitrogen. We, as everyone knows, I'm sure the people on the sustainability committee know as well, nitrogen's a big issue that we're fighting as well. And so these, not only is the kelp taking up nitrogen, but it takes up more in the regions that have excessive nitrogen. And I won't linger on this too long, but we have a technique for looking at where the nitrogen's coming from that they take up. It's looking at the isotopes and the ratio of the atomic weight of the isotopes of nitrogen in the kelp. We call it the Del-N15 signature. And here's these numbers. They may not tell you a lot, but they tell me a lot because we compare this to the nitrogen that we find in wastewater and the nitrogen that we find in fertilizer. And so if these kelp were using nitrogen just from fertilizer, they would have a value of -3 on this scale. If they're using mainly wastewater, they'd have a signature approaching 10 on this scale. So you can clearly see not only are they taking up the nitrogen, but they're taking up nitrogen that originates from wastewater. Now, let me be clear. This is atomic nitrogen. So this has nothing to do with any, don't think about like what wastewater is. It just tells you ultimately where the nitrogen came from in the very first place. And that is, it looks like it's coming from wastewater. So between this slide and this one, what I'm telling you is that when you put these kelp in locations that have an overloading of nitrogen from wastewater, and we know that's where our nitrogen mainly comes from, so this is not a surprise, they're able to take that nitrogen out of the water column. And, right now we're doing all of our work at really what I would call the experimental phase, right? We're growing, I told you, 100-foot lines, which is a lot. And I told you we're producing 1,000 pounds with just 3 lines. But this could be scaled up. So just for perspective, this is what Mike Dole has come up with. Suppose you wanted to have a 1-acre kelp farm, which really isn't that big. You can see here, he's showing the spacing. And so here, if you had 3 lines, that's where we are to begin with. And he's now instead scaling out the 200-foot lines instead of 100-foot, and you want to space these about 5 foot apart. But if you were to do that, and you had a 1-acre plot, and you got the kinds of yields that we saw last year, you'd end up pulling out per farm somewhere between 32,000 and 72,000 pounds of kelp per acre. And if we scale that on the nitrogen level, this could be almost 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And for perspective there, another hat I wear at the university is I'm the director of the New York State Center for Clean Water Technology. We focus a lot on alternative septic systems. Those septic systems denitrify about 12 pounds of nitrogen per year per 2-person household. And so that amount of nitrogen that could be removed by the kelp is up to 18 homes. Now, what's important to recognize here is that nobody's doing 1-acre farms of kelp. So this is really just a thought experiment to give you the sense that there is the promise there for really mitigating nitrogen. I'm not advocating for this instead of upgrading homes, but it can be yet another what we call tool in the toolbox. Before I get to ocean acidification and climate change, one last topic I want to hit on is harmful algal blooms. If you've ever heard me speak before, this is what I speak about probably the most. These harmful algal blooms can be both toxic and harmful to humans, as well as toxic and harmful to marine life, and in some cases have been responsible for the collapse of some New York fisheries, like the bay scallop. Now, as it turns out, each of these different harmful algal blooms happen at a different time of the year. Some are in spring, some are in summer. So when we think about different seaweeds and the effects they might have on these harmful algal blooms, we need to think about the seasons in which they occur. So I'm not going to talk about it today, but in my lab, we're also working on the aquaculture of gracilaria, which is a red algae. We've also done work with sea lettuce, ulva, which is often considered a nuisance algae, but we've been able to grow it at high capacity. But sticking with the kelp for a moment, you can see it really overlaps with this species Alexandrium, which frankly to me is the most worrying of the harmful algal blooms. And that's because it makes this compound known as saxitoxin. Saxitoxin is a neurotoxin. Saxitoxin is 1,000 times more potent than cyanide. And it can be a threat to human health because filter feeding bivalves such as mussels, clams, oysters, scallops, concentrate, by virtue of their name, filter feeding, they're concentrating the plankton as they grow, and they can concentrate both the cells and then the toxin that's within those cells. And this organism is widespread across Long Island. You can see here, any of the sites where you see a red dot is a site where the densities have gotten high enough to make shellfish toxic. And we've had literally more than a dozen shellfish bed closures due to toxic shellfish, and half a dozen sites that have been closed to shellfishing because of blooms of Alexandrium and the presence of saxitoxin in shellfish. And beyond just the human health threat, this is also an animal health threat. In 2015, there was a kill of more than, of hundreds of diamondback terrapin turtles in Flanders Bay. At the time, no one, including myself, knew what was going on. It had been suggested that it could be related to an ongoing bloom of Alexandrium and paralytic shellfish poisoning. I dismissed that hypothesis initially, but as we gathered the data, like looking at the toxicity of the mussels in the region, and then looking at using DNA sequencing to look at the gut contents of the turtles, as it turns out, they were eating those mussels, and those mussels got toxic enough to the point where just consumption of one mussel would be enough to kill off these turtles, which are close to being an endangered species in New York. So this is obviously the right type of harmful algal bloom to consider how it might be affected by seaweeds. And I'll give acknowledgement to my graduate student, Peter Silvers, who's looking at that. and looking specifically at kelp and a couple of other seaweeds and how they could affect Alexandrium. And so just to give you a sense, if you were to look under the microscope, these are happy and healthy Alexandrium cells. When you expose them to kelp, after just a couple of days, the cells begin to look like this. And what you're looking at are cells that are experiencing what we call chlorosis. So the nice pigment on the inside is shrinking up. And in some case, cell lysis. So you can see the outside of the cell lysing and the inside just spilling out. So you can see it in the microscope. You can also see it in the cell counts. Here's an experiment from the field. We grew Alexandrium where we added nutrients, or alternatively, we added nutrients plus kelp, and it significantly reduced the number of cells. When we looked at what was going on there, just very briefly, when we added the nutrients as expected, the nutrient concentrations went up. But when we added the nutrients and the kelp kept the nutrient levels low, in fact, lower than when in the other treatment. So they're actively taking up nutrients in order to combat the harmful algae. A final thing that we did was to look at the ability of the kelp to prevent mussels from becoming toxic. So we did a 4-day experiment where we exposed mussels to toxic Alexandrium cells and the same exact scenario, but also exposed them to kelp. And we saw that the kelp was able to significantly reduce the amount of toxin in the shellfish. It didn't eliminate it entirely, but the actual numbers are important. And that is the FDA closure limit for shellfish is 80 micrograms per 100 grams of shellfish. By adding the kelp, we could keep the mussels below that level. The final thing to talk about is the threat of ocean acidification. I don't need to belabor this point with this group. A lot of people had said, oh, in 2020, everybody stopped driving and the factory shut down. So the CO2 levels must have gotten really low. And so while there was less CO2 produced, the fact of the matter is that was not seen in the global CO2 data set. So here's the data from Scripps Oceanographic. This is known as the Keeling curve. And so these are the direct measurements made by Charles David Keeling since the middle of the 20th century. Dr. Keeling passed away, I believe, sometime in the last decade, but this data set's been kept up by Scripps Oceanographic. And you can see these numbers are only moving in one direction. And frankly, unfortunately, because of the global intensity of prior anthropogenic activities, we could cease combusting all fossil fuels and these levels will still go up. So that little blip of 2020 is not in the records here. And we know, of course, that not only is the CO2 going up in our atmosphere, it's going up in our oceans, and that's leading to lower levels of pH today than we had in the past. And we know this is really an existential threat to bivalves. Bivalves make calcium carbonate shells. Higher levels of CO2 lead to lower levels of pH, and more importantly for the bivalves, lower levels of carbonate that they need to make their calcium carbonate shells. And so about a decade ago, my lab published on the threat of ocean acidification to some of our regional bivalves. These are larval bay scallops and hard clams. In this case, we compared what was then the ambient levels of CO2. So it really we're really dated here. We're now at 417. This experiment was a decade ago when we were only at 390. So the one relevant thing here is that if you look, we use 250 as a pre-industrial level of CO2. And the first important finding here is that compared to pre-industrial levels of CO2, the survival of these bivalve larvae at today's levels of CO2 were statistically lower. And what that's telling us is that today's ocean acidification is already affecting bivalves. We don't need to think about the future. It's already here. And you can see as things progress, things don't get any better. We also took microscopic images of these bivalves. You can see them here, both hard clams and bay scallops. And you can see as you ramp up the CO2 levels, these individuals get smaller and smaller. And this image, I'm proud to say, was actually used by the Obama White House when they issued their report called The Challenge of Ocean Acidification in 2014. This was figure 3 of 4 figures within that document. We also looked at how thin these bivalves became, and that's shown here. And you can see the shells went from being extremely thick to quite thin. And so the question is, can seaweeds combat this? My lab's actually already proven that they can. So this is a paper we published a few years back. It's available free online. Anybody can download it. And essentially what it showed was the ability of, in this case, for this first set of experiments, we just used ova and to understand how it might affect the growth of, you can see 4 different bivalves here we studied: clams, lobsters, clams, oysters, scallops, and mussels. And what we saw is that when we grew oysters, for example, with ova, there was not a big effect. When we added CO2 to an environmentally realistic level, growth rates plummeted to near 0. But when we added in the seaweeds, we could significantly increase those growth rates. Couldn't fully rescue them, but significantly increase the rate at which the oysters could grow. And we know this was due to the chemistry. And just as an example, here's an experiment that we did just earlier this month, in fact, since it is kelp season, where we took acidified water and we either added living and growing kelp to it or not. And we divided that up, and you can see the pH scale here, and you can see how in just a matter of days from February 26th to just, well, I guess less than a week later or a week or so later, the pH went from a very low and damaging level to actually almost, not almost, a basified level. So actually much higher than you would see. So this is a very strong anti-acidification effect. And going back to that graduate student, Peter Silvers, and his work, this is his data on 3 different types of seaweeds, including kelp, essentially just showing that, you know, if he did nothing, these dots here on the, where he added no macroalgae, the pH was always around 8. And you can see that the seaweeds all drove up that pH. So therefore, if we look at all of these effects, and I can see I have a little bit of a cutoff here, that's supposed to say protecting shellfish aquaculture with kelp, the halo effect. And so that's the one important thing I want to emphasize here, that the effect word got cut off. But, you know, seaweeds are not going to, at a local level at least, you know, be the only tool in the toolbox for combating climate change, obviously. But because of this very concentrated, localized effect, I think they're an incredibly useful tool for protecting shellfish aquaculture. Very last thing I want to leave you with is just some work we're doing on using these seaweeds to convert them into fertilizer. You know, I always have this vision, you know, we live on an island, and every spring as we get towards the growing season, I have this vision of all these 18-wheelers driving over the bridges onto Long Island, be it the Throgs Neck or the Whitestone or, you know, the Verrazano Bridge, but bringing all this fertilizer onto Long Island. And wouldn't it be great if we could break that cycle and have that fertilizer come from somewhere else? And we've made some progress on this at the university. If you look here, I've got 3 different types of fertilizer here, and they have the nitrogen and phosphorus content. And right now I've hidden the labels here. One of these 3 is Miracle Grow. The other 2 is based on seaweeds. So by eye, can you tell which is the Miracle Grow and which is the seaweeds? This is the nitrogen content that we're able to generate per liter of solution from a liquid Miracle Grow and from 2 other types of seaweeds. So this is the game show part of the seminar. Can you guess which is the Miracle Grow? And now you can tell me if you guessed correctly. So the bottom line is we can make a solution far more potent than Miracle Grow out of seaweeds. And so this is, you can see what we can now generate out of kelp. And we also, work with summer seaweeds, which actually accumulate a lot more nitrogen and phosphorus, or actually even more potent. We've also used these on different crops. This is my son, now 12. I believe in this picture he might have been 10. But again, we can play the guessing game. Can you guess which set of eggplants received the seaweed fertilizer? Probably can. So we were able to demonstrate that the seaweed fertilizers are able to significantly enhance the weight of eggplant yields compared to not using any fertilizer. We had similar results with bell peppers, both with regards to weight and number of fruits. And finally, this data is a little bit more complex. In this case, our positive control was Miracle Grow. Our negative control was doing nothing. And this is for marigolds. And so you can see Miracle Grow does the job for these flowers. If we use just a kelp-based fertilizer, well, it's certainly better than nothing, not quite the Miracle Grow. If we use the summer seaweeds, again, significantly better and approaching the Miracle Grow, but actually when we combine them, we have the best yields of all. So we are seeing the potential for these seaweeds to turn into fertilizer to make a sustainable fertilizer. So with that, I'm done. So I've shown you that seaweeds can improve water quality by removing CO2 and nitrogen, secreting oxygen and secreting allelopathic compounds to mitigate harmful algal blooms. And I've shown you some of these harmful algal blooms are lysed, and the toxicity can be mitigated, and the ocean acidification can be mitigated by kelp. We still need research, however, to really hone in on the exact scale that's needed to have these environmental effects. The good news is, like I said, if your target is simply a shellfish farm, you just need that halo effect. So with that, I'm done. I hope I didn't go too long, and I'm happy to discuss things or take questions now or later.
No, we
Great. That was spectacular, Chris. Thanks so much. It's great to see how the kelp is interacting in the real world environments and all of the analytics that you've applied to it with chemistry and so forth. We're going to do questions after we've had the three speakers get a chance to address the audience. With that, let me introduce our second speaker. Sean Barrett is a co-founder of Dr. Dish in Montauk. He is one of the co-founders of the first community-supported fisheries in New York State. Now he has 45 fishermen, and that has been connected to chefs and individuals who join the local purchase of seafood in advance. Sean is also on the board of Green Wave, which is the Connecticut not-for-profit that has created the 3D restorative ocean farming model that Chris just referred to. And they have plans to train 5,000 more ocean farmers nationally. They've recently launched a campaign called Eat More Kelp. And I believe, Mark, you're going to run a short video that comes from Sean. Okay, great. So we're going to just proceed with that. Thanks. Sound?
If I could project, there's when you go to share, there's before you do share, you might want to unshare and then start again. There's two options when you go to share. One is for making sure you're also sharing the sound, and there's another box to tick that would say, I can pretend I'm going to share. There's a box to click for share sound. There's another one to clip. Okay. There we go. That sounded good.
Is that it?
Yep.
Well, we don't
Hearing
see
it, but we're not seeing it.
The current industrial seafood model has led to a depletion of our ocean.
You're not seeing it, though.
But here at Google New York, we have an opportunity to influence and introduce.
Hold on. Got it?
It's good, Mark. Very good.
The current industrial seafood model has led to a depletion of our ocean. But here at Google New York, we have an opportunity to influence and introduce a whole new way of eating and offering our seafood. We believe in supporting wild fishermen, but also believe that we have a chance to reimagine how we farm seafood. So we're working with two local fishermen, Dr. Dish and Thimble Island Oyster Company.
Sean Barrett, and I'm a co-founder of Dr. Dish, which is the first community supported fishery in Long Island. Our members are committing before the season and saying we're willing to surrender our traditional right to demand from fishermen and say, fishermen, go catch us this. It fundamentally changes the question to what have you caught today? So all of our members, the restaurants, they all know exactly who caught their fish, where it was caught, when it was caught, how it was caught, and all this really important information that we believe you have the right to know. And we really disrupted the traditional chain of custody for seafood, which essentially from the fisherman's hands to the end consumer hands in the United States, that chain of custody, the amount of people who are actually taking possession of that fish before it goes from dock to dish, can have anywhere between 6, 10, 20, 30 different sets of hands, where Dr. Dish has come in and really kind of been pierced through that veil and created a new system that's only really 3 sets of hands. It's the fishermen, our cooperative and our management team here, and our members. Companies like Google and forward-thinking organizations are able to kind of say, this is the way that fisheries really should be operated. And so we're psyched to be working with you guys.
So my name is Bren Smith. I'm here in the Thimble Islands. I'm the owner of Thimble Island Ocean Farm. What's innovative about urban sea farming is that we grow a whole range of species. We grow only things that are restorative, only things that require no fresh water, no fertilizer, no land, no animal feed, making it the most sustainable food on the planet. In a 1 acre area, I can grow up to 30 tons of kelp and a couple 100,000 shellfish per acre. Right? Incredible amount of volume. Our kelp soaks up 5 times more carbon than land-based plants. Our oysters soak up nitrogen. Our entire farms function as artificial reef systems, which attract hundreds of different species. Our kelp can be used as biofuel, so we can actually start powering our farms with alternative energy. I think this model of choosing to grow just sustainable restorative species is really the direction we need to go. There are over 10,000 edible plants in the sea. Our job as fishermen farmers is to learn how to grow them and grow them well, grow good nutritious food. And that's really all we can do. Our job is then to hand them to the brilliant chefs at places like Google to innovate, to create new dishes of the future. What I think of, we're climate farmers, the chefs need to be develop a new climate cuisine. Stop trying to just search for the fish you want to eat, like salmon, like tuna. Choose to eat different things. Move plants to the center of the plate, sea greens to the center, bivalves to the center, and then do wild fish at the edges. We need to reorganize this plate for the future of our ocean.
Hey, everybody. I'm Sean Barrett. Great to see you all. And thank you for putting this together. Drawdown, Mary and company.
Welcome.
Dr. Gobler, thank you for a great intro and for leading the league in fumble recoveries with that tech recovery you just helped us out with. I also want to say Sister Carrie's here, a good friend of mine. I see Jason Wiener and Peter Strigatz, Lindsay Olson from Green Wave. Great turnout tonight. I'm really happy to see so many people turning out to talk about kelp. As you guys saw in that video, that's actually a quite old video, but Bren Smith who's in that video, and we've been good friends for a long time. About 10 years ago, he came to me with this vision. He was thimble eye on oysters at that time, but his vision, which he just described in that video, was that we should be farming vegetables from the sea and things that don't swim away, and creating a climate cuisine. And originally, I began in community supported fisheries in Montauk about 10 years ago. Brent and I both come from deep backgrounds working in the water and in the oceans. And so most of anyone who has over the last 20 or 30 years has seen a lot of changes. And so we were both kind of alarmed and driven to try to make changes and improvements to the systems that we were using. And I think along the way, I've had some great mentors and help. Dr. Gobler has an amazing State of the Bays address, which for anyone who's interested is this Thursday at 7. Very informative and was something that propelled me along on my path. But I think from the kelp perspective, kelp growing perspective, about 5 years ago, Bren started saying to me, like, we needed to get kelp farming moved into the New York area. And so at that time, Mike Dole, who Dr. Gobler mentioned, was an oyster farmer in town. And so at first I started mentioning to him, about kelp farming. He looked at me like I had two heads. He said, no one's ever going to eat seaweed. You're just not going to happen. And so over time, we went out to a few dinners. We started talking about it. And eventually he said, let me get Dr. Gobler and talk to him about it. And then really this kind of magic carpet ride, as Dr. Gobler accurately described, has happened where over the last 3 years, we've seen this very rapid acceleration. All roads do lead to Greenwave. I must say that organization has provided nursery support, all types of technological support, certainly moral support and advocacy for us to keep going. But we are right now at a very interesting place in New York State where we have the first research, I think 16 or 17 total sites right now that are growing all different types, or the same species, but in all different water types, as Dr. Gobler said. And it's a really exciting time, finally, where this kind of vision that Brent Smith, and we used to argue about it, where I was like, I don't think we should be farming anything out of the ocean. And Brent eventually brought me around to see that all farming in the ocean is not the same. His regenerative farming that he described in the video is really has to be as we're moving forward. And I think it's easy to come after Dr. Gobler because he just lays a bedrock of scientific information for everyone. I think, or for me anyway, I should speak for myself, that makes it very clear to see that we need to move and act on this. And I feel like for a few years, I had been egging on like Bren and Greenwave and Mike Dole and the farmers. And I should also correct the record here and say I'm not a kelp farmer. Bren would have a meltdown if he heard that. But I get brought into the formula when it's time where the rubber meets the road, essentially. Now, when you get the science right, when you get the farming right, what do you do with that kelp once it comes out of the water? So I see Jason Wiener is a chef friend of mine from Almond who's on here tonight and is probably wringing his hands wondering when his first delivery of Montauk kelp is going to arrive at his doorstep, and he'll have to figure that out. But that's really where Brent said to me, no, we're going to do all the groundwork here, build tiers and the structure in New York to get regenerative kelp farming started on a very strong foundation. And I kept saying, like, whenever you guys are ready, get the kelp to me and I'll help you. I'll take the lead with getting it on people's plates, using a lot of our experience and connections from Dr. Dish. And now we are at that point. So I'm going to be lobbying and pushing all of you to hashtag eat more kelp. My good friend Jennifer Jacquette is here tonight. And I know that Scott Bluedorn also have their Eat More Kelp bumper stickers driving around town. And we're starting to get people in their t-shirts and hats and just start to build awareness about kelp. I think Lindsay Olson at Greenwave also got an Eat More Kelp package from us. Yeah. So, and I'm really excited to say a lot of the offshoots from Greenwave's work in Alaska and in Maine right now are pushing very rapidly forward with kelp products that are coming to market. So I know Mary has tried the Akua kelp burger, which is now available. Atlantic Seed Farms in Maine has got a whole interesting menu of different seaweed salads and things that are starting to show up in Whole Foods and places like that. So kelp as cuisine, and this climate cuisine, that Bren Smith's original vision of, like, you know, creating a whole cuisine essentially with the chefs, that centers around foodstuffs that actually lower carbon, pull nitrogen out of the waterways and have a regenerative effect on the ecosystem, is the intersection we've just arrived at. So I'm going to leave some time here for Scott to chime in and for some Q&A at the end. But I would ask you guys to check out greenwave.org for more information on regenerative kelp farming and the whole vision and idea. Also eatmorekelp.com, where you can find all kinds of good stuff to get awareness built about eating more kelp. And as I mentioned, if you're around on Thursday night, Dr. Goldber's State of the Bays address is a surefire eye opener. It is every year, and one of our top recommended events of the whole calendar year. So yeah, in the chat here, I just saw the Akua kelp burger, and Mary should be able to put some more links in there. So anyone who's interested to try kelp, who's never had kelp, my friend Jennifer and her daughter Zila yesterday were trying out some new kelp popcorn. There's new kelp pastas that are coming online, and you can find, Mary should be putting some of these in the chat right now. And so that's the area where if you're asking yourself, like, how do I get involved? How can I help? How can I kelp this along? By actually purchasing and trying as many of these new kelp products as you possibly can is where my job is to really advocate and accelerate that part of market penetration, where kelp is really becoming a part of our dinner and lunch and breakfast and wherever else you like it. So our mantra is we get by with a little kelp from our friends, and I encourage you all to do that. And with that, I'm going to close and hand it over to my buddy Scott, and then I think we have Q&A coming at the end.
Thanks very much, Sean. That was excellent. And our third guest is Scott Bludorn. He's an artist who draws inspiration from local traditions, something he calls maritime cosmology. Scott is an avid environmentalist with interests in conservation, composting, aquaculture, and biodesign, and is a member of the East Hampton Energy and Sustainability Committee. So Scott, you have said that kelp aquaculture will be a powerful asset in building an equitable and bioregenerative industry for the East End. Can you tell us what you mean by equitable and bioregenerative, and why is that important to you?
Scott, you got to unmute, buddy.
Okay, rookie move there. Hi, everyone. Thanks again for having me here tonight. Drawdown, doing really important work. And also hi to Sean and Dr. Chris. Really like that report and a bunch of really cool, great information that I hadn't heard. So that recent research is really interesting. To address some of these questions, so what I mean by a bioregenerative and equitable industry is we have to face a lot of facts about tradition and industry on the east end of Long Island, which traditionally has been a fishing and farming community. And unfortunately, the fishing industry is in a pretty rapid decline for a lot of different reasons. Although we do still have a great viable fishery, there's not that many fishermen left. We also know what's going on with shellfish crashes due to a huge amount of problems related climate and also water acidification. So our industries are in decline, but what we need to do is actually look at things like kelp and seaweed aquaculture, particularly to kind of reinvigorate these industries. And we can bring in a lot of people, including fishermen who have been, they've been subject to a lot of laws, a lot of regulation, which is good, but they are also looking for a way to sustain what they do, which is providing wild food. And that's what Sean has been working on specifically. So if you have kelp and seaweed aquaculture as a new industry here, we have the opportunity to bring in aquaculturists who are growing oysters, all the fishermen, people who work on and live on the water, and we can even bring in traditional agriculture, permaculture, people who are farming on land. It's a really amazing thing that Green Wave has actually become a nonprofit, and they're taking applications for new farmers. And a lot of these people are traditionally maybe not involved with aquaculture. There's a lot of women getting involved, people of color. There's a lot of indigenous people, people of color, like I said. So we have a really great opportunity, I think, to open this up if it becomes what I think it can be, and which has great potential. A new industry that is also bioregenerative for all the reasons that Dr. Gobler said here. It is such a great sequester of nitrogen and carbon, and it actually is going to help rehabilitate our waters that are in such, they're in a lot of trouble right now. So yeah, I want to add in, that kelp particularly has all these amazing uses, and there's all this great research now that's being spearheaded. And I think it's amazing that we just find more and more uses and more benefits to growing kelp and other seaweeds. And what we need to do now is make sure that we can actually grow this as a commercial product. And that actually is going to require sponsoring legislation. And sometimes it's just as easy as just putting the word seaweed into the existing aquaculture legislation. So that's Fred Thiel's office, which, there is stalled legislation to make that happen. There is a great petition now on change.org that we want everyone tonight to sign to try to raise the idea that we have to put pressure on our elected officials to get these things passed and to support the provisions that we're going to need to create this viable industry here. So that's a lot of what my work has kind of been focusing on. I am a member of the Energy Sustainability Committee in East Hampton, and I've taken this on kind of as a passion project to try to push it forward. And then even in my own work as an artist, I've actually been collecting kelp just from the shoreline for a number of years now, and I eat it all the time. And it's fun because if you go out to Montauk Point, it's kind of the only place you're going to find it locally. But you'll see that there's a lot of people who are noticing that it's there. You'll see a lot of Korean people who have traditionally eaten kelp for centuries. They know that it's there, and they do collect it as a wild food. And I cook with it all the time. I just made a kelp mac and cheese the other night. So it's amazing, what you can actually bring into your own kitchen, and you can experiment with it. And it's also on the design front, this amazing new thing that artists are starting to look at as material. Two noteworthy artists and designers that I've seen are, one is Juliet Lohman, who created this thing called the Department of Seaweed. And she's building these amazing kind of sculptures and biomorphic designs out of kelp itself. And then there's another woman in Australia named Jessie French, who started Other Matter, which is looking at new uses for bioplastics that are directly derived from seaweeds and other kelps. So as a new material, there's a lot of promise, not just in traditional bioplastics, but in design for art and for even packaging. So it's just another amazing use that it's like one of these miracle products like hemp and like a number of other species that we're finding more and more use for. And it's probably just going to keep expanding in that way. So thanks. I guess, are we going to turn it over to questions now?
Yes, thanks a lot, Scott. Really appreciate all your efforts. You've been, as you say, championing the focus on kelp at the Sustainability Committee in East Hampton for a while. And obviously I've been psyched that you've taken that on and helped to be sort of the glue in this sort of kelp effort in a lot of ways. So appreciate that. Yeah, so we have a lot of fascinating questions. It's great how much interest this is. We could probably do another session on this, but Mark and I are going to switch off, just choosing a couple to talk about. one from Francesca Rhiannon. She asked Dr. Gobler about, is it nitrogen neutral? It takes it out of the water. And I wanted to sort of take a spin off, but does it also release it? And I've heard about also the carbon binding. That kelp sometimes floats out into the deep water, and it sinks to the bottom of the ocean, and as a result is one of the most permanent carbon sequestration sinks, whereas soil and forests can be cut and the carbon is re-released. So curious how it's clear that kelp does a lot to help balance the environment that it's in when it's being grown, and is a real sort of beneficial thing while it's there. But what about it being a negative, like a carbon sink and a nitrogen sink versus is it neutral? Do you know? Can you address that question?
Yeah, sure. So I mean that the answer there is that it's all dependent on whether you harvest it or not and when you harvest it. So if you our strategy, if you let it die on the vine, so to speak, yep, it's going to release everything right back into the water. And so and that's why we time our harvests to be before that happens. And you can see as the temperatures rise through the spring, they grow really rapidly, but when it gets to, we count things in Celsius. So beyond 15 or approaching 20 Celsius, you can tell that their days are numbered, and that's when we seek to get them out. As far as permanent carbon sequestration, that's a fair question. I don't know much about deep ocean kelp, sinking deep ocean kelp, but certainly that CO2, part of it, if it goes into soils, for example, part of it's going to stay in the soils there. Yeah.
Okay, great. Mark, you want to have a question you like?
I can suggest one.
Yeah, please, Mary.
There's a couple, maybe for Sean, about the barriers to kelp farming by, I guess, bay farmers, but also ocean fishermen. Can you talk about what the biggest barriers are right now?
Yeah, sure. The biggest barrier that we're facing right now is that kelp farming is actually not legal in New York State. And so I originally told Brandon, a couple of the guys, I had an attitude of like, I'd rather beg for forgiveness than ask for permission. I had some wiser, older folks in the community advise against that. So we've now taken the approach on Thursday. I think that meeting got moved. We're now meeting with Senator Kaminsky, and we have this petition to legalize kelp farming in New York State has about 6,000-ish signatures on there. So that would be another area, if you guys are willing to sign on to that petition, the more names and signatures we have in support of that. Obviously, it's going to go a long way to help get the kelp bill passed. So Carl Safina also a number of years ago put me on the Marine Resources Advisory Council at the DEC, where we pushed this bill through with a 10-0, which is, it's a partisan council. It's very rare that we vote 10-0 for anything, but this is something that's got pretty much across the board support from the commercial fishery, from the recreational fishery. From the fisheries side, there's a big warm welcome embrace for kelp farming. I think there's just a lag behind, as Dr. Gobler said. New York is just a little bit behind the curve, where all the rest of the states up to the east, from Maine, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, all have kelp farming, regulated kelp farming, but New York State just does not have a regulatory framework right now to manage farming of kelp. So I think that stands right now as the biggest hurdle in our way. And actually currently right now, this year's crop that we kind of we're stuck with, our farmers are not gonna be able to really sell it. So I think by this time next year, we wanna make absolutely certain that we've punctured through or knocked down that regulatory barrier. And the best way that we know how to do that, the proper channel, is by signing on to this petition for Senator Kaminsky, which we're going to be presenting to him in person within the next week or so. So yeah, that's it.
And then given the fact that, let's say it does pass, then are there barriers for kelp farming in general? What keeps, what would make it helpful for people to become kelp farmers?
Yeah, great. So what we originally the grant that Dr. Goldberg spoke about, and the monoculture oyster farmers, and creating a polyculture kind of situation where they have two species that they're growing. What we realized was in Maine, a lot of the kelp farmers are lobster fishermen, or they're existing tradespeople who work on the water and are very well intimated with working on the ocean and sourcing food from the ocean. So we're kind of following in their footsteps with oyster farmers. There's many reasons why that the first waves that we're going for commercial purposes are with oyster growers who have, they have boats, they have knowledge of the water, they have a lot of experience with all the many variables that are involved in the wild ecosystems. And so I think that's what you're going to most likely be seeing over the next 6 to 12 months will be a big push in that area. And also we're trying to keep it, if you look at the kelp bill, the language is going to keep this to Peconic and to gardeners for now. And we're hoping just to keep it small and controlled in there with experienced oyster growers who know what they're doing. Because even this year, Dr. Gobler will tell you, we are having this astonishing growth rate with some of the research sites, but we are also having failures. We're having slip gut and other types of experiences that are suffocating and choking out some of the sugar kelp growing sites. So we still have some experimenting to do as far as just getting the kelp growing right. But as far as the next wave or phase of who we predict is going to be leading that charge, I would look to oyster growers and gardeners and Peconic.
Just a quick update on that. We did get an email from Fred Thiel saying that the legislation was introduced in February 1st to the Environmental Conservation Committees in both houses for review. As soon as the budget is determined, the state budget, he's going to work with Assemblyman Engelbright to further the legislation, and he really invites Southampton Sustainability, Drawdown East End, and anybody else to help advocate for the passage of this bill. So they're definitely being attentive.
Great. And one really extremely important point, guys, I would say, if you could look in the chat, you'll see a friend of mine, Kelly Dennis from the Shinnecock Reservation, has put a really important note in there that the Native Americans at Shinnecock have for hundreds of years been working in kelp and kelp farming and things. And you'll see Kelly's note in the chat is just very important for everyone to take a look at.
I've got a question here that might be for Dr. Gobler, and I don't know how to phrase it well enough, not my science not being strong enough, but the question is, when kelp takes up nitrogen, does it get given up again later? So in other words, is it nitrogen neutral, nitrogen negative? And I would tag on to that, if kelp is taking in CO2, when does it release it again, and in what amounts and so on, or is that still in the early phases of research?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of spoke about that in my last comment, and the bottom line is, if you harvest it before it dies on the vine, you're ensuring that the nitrogen carbon does not go back into the environment, and rather you're extracting it.
Okay, thanks.
Eat it.
Okay, let's see. What else do we have here? So you talked, Sean, briefly about developing the markets. It was mostly about food. Are you aware of other markets, or Scott, that the local kelp growers could plug into? I mean, I think that Mark and my question about carbon sequestration suggests the possibility of it being, carbon credit recipient. That's sort of maybe another marketplace. But besides food, Scott mentioned a bunch of other markets. How can local, people who are looking to develop an economic engine connect with other marketplaces?
Oh yeah, you go ahead.
Go for it.
Well, I'll just say that a couple of years ago on the North Fork, the Cornell Cooperative Extension kind of spurred a challenge for a lot of local makers to figure out things that they could make with an experimental crop that was grown with their pilot program there. And there was this great event that was held at the brewing company and Greenport Harbor Brewing Company, and they did a beer, and they had some soap makers and people who made bath products, soaks. There was like beauty products. It was really cool to see that. There's a possibility for a whole cottage industry for people who make, use kelp as an additive for a lot of different things. Anything that's like in the herbal kind of realm, it can be used in that same way. And it's kind of really interesting to find. To me, I think that, if you experiment with this material, you can find out so many things that it can be used for. So there's that, and endless expansion. But fertilizers also, of course, bioplastics, also animal feed is a huge one that a lot of research has supported, that cows that are fed seaweed, not specifically kelp, I forget the other one, I'm sure maybe Dr. Gobler knows, but they actually reduce the methane that they're emitting when they're fed seaweed as an additive in their feed. So there's just so many things that I think are going to come out of this.
Well, Sean, did you have any other thoughts on that? How to
yeah, I think it was bladderwrack is the seaweed you were talking about, Scott, with animal feeds. But I also know another area that we are behind in New York State, and this was part of our initial thrust with our community supported kelp crop project, was the other states, and Lindsay at Greenwave, and Greenwave leads a lot of this work. But there's a whole series of testing that also has to be done for foods, and not to rain on the parade, but kelps do have an affinity for heavy metals at times, and the local waterways, as Dr. Gobler has so accurately pointed out, there are some interesting things going on that I think another burden before we really start getting New York kelp into the marketplace. There's going to be Department of Health and probably a few other regulatory bodies that are going to have to do some pretty heavy analysis on just safety concerns, and specifically food safety concerns. I think that's another hurdle or barrier we're going to have to get over at some point before we really start penetrating the market. But Scott's 100% right. There is a enormous constellation of end uses. Brent Smith is pretty famous for just kind of rattling off all the pharmaceuticals and fuels and fertilizers and all the different areas where he would like to see kelp just be a ubiquitous substance, really, that we're using kind of like soy or other things right now. But I think to put the cart in front of put the horse in front of the cart, we have to get through a few more layers of regulatory and safety checks with our New York kelp, because it is so new and we just don't have any of that data yet. So hopefully Dr. Gobler will be leading the charge on that end too.
Great. Yeah, I think it's exciting, all these potential cottage industries. I mean, I know, Scott, you've done art with kelp.
Yeah.
Like an art, a lamp, I believe. Mary, did you have a question?
Yeah, there's a question here that was chimed in on. Would the Sustainability Committee of Southampton and another Sustainability Committee said yes, they would too, send a letter of support for the kelp bill to Senator Palumbo and Assemblyman Thiel?
Yes, we certainly will do that.
Oh, great. And is there a possibility of continuing this discussion of advancing, this idea of a local blue-green economy in further meetings?
Absolutely. There's
wonderful.
nothing which will stop that. That's what we're here for.
Excellent.
Good. I have a question. I know that recreationalists have been concerned about floating gear for oyster production. All of the Greenwave illustrations show all of the aquaculture happening below the surface. Is there, anybody have any thoughts or comments about this vis-a-vis it being compatible with other uses of the waters?
I'll just mention this has been a big point of contention on the East End. You may be familiar with the Devon Yacht Club lawsuit, where some people didn't like the idea that their views were obscured by oyster gear. I mean, maybe there's the claim that there's a navigational issue, but the bottom line is that aquaculture takes up less than a fraction of a % of the surface waters across the East End. And with regards to kelp, we're for our current project, and there's no reason for this not to be for any project. It gets removed by Memorial Day, and so I think most boaters are not going to be running into kelp lines for that reason. But it is a real issue. Like I said, the Devon Yacht Club was a lawsuit brought against by a yacht club against aquaculturists because the presence of the gear in a place where they didn't want it. And so, I think I don't think I don't think the issue that it's with regards to navigation is truly an issue, but it is an issue that needs to be confronted because that sort of suit could be brought again. But I don't, again, because on the kelp front, it's removed by Memorial Day, so it's not an issue for most boaters. And, and even if the Peconic Estuary leasing program hits its full stride, it's just a tiny, tiny fraction of the whole estuary. So, but it's something to bear in mind because it could be an obstacle to future progress. Sean, I don't know if you want to comment on that as well.
Yeah, that's no, you hit the nail on the head, Dr. Gobler. And I think when that came before the Marine Resources Advisory Council, that was a concern. But it's all submerged, a few small buoys on top. And the DEC was making the case for us actually that once water temperatures get above 51 degrees, there's a major die-off. And so that the water temperatures, as you said, before or right around Memorial Day, you would see all of the kelp farms kind of unwound and undone. That really wouldn't interfere with the height of boating season, which historically is post Memorial Day. It fits.
Okay. I guess unless there are any other questions that anybody has or wants to raise.
No, I think we can conclude, huh?
Yeah, so Dieter, I would love to have you express any thoughts before we wrap it up, and then I'll say thank you.
Thank you, Cray. And first of all, thank you to our 3 presenters. That was very, very, very knowledgeable of what we needed. I had no idea what kelp can all do, etc. But what the lesson I take out of this one, the most important part is that we all sign this petition and get the law in place that the fishermen who are presently, like Sean, experimenting with this, that they have a chance to make a business out of it. I mean, you are in the learning process and that's fine, but you can't learn for the next few years. You have to make a business out of it. And we all should sign it. And please go into the chat and look up how and where to sign this petition. Most important for us. I'd like to thank everyone who participated in this, everyone who put their brain work to it to get a wonderful program going. It is something unusual for both the Sustainability Committee and Drawdown to pick up a subject like this and run with it. And it showed how well this works. And if we can always do this to combine our strengths and get something going jointly, where it could lead to. Chris, particularly, everyone knows you anyway. So you have given that scientific underlying information, which is so important that everyone sees what it is. You are known as Mr. Water and Mr. Algae, but now you get an extra title of Dr. Kelp. Okay, I'd like to conclude. Thank everyone who organized it and everyone who commented. Our speakers, thank you very much. And we'll keep in touch. Thank you, everyone.
Stay safe, you guys. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Eat more kelp.
Eat more kelp.
Help.
Bye.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.